Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we will review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA professional development. For more information about us and certification maintenance hours, go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. SLP Nerdcast is brought to you in part by listeners like you. You can support our work by going to our website or social media pages and contributing. You can also find permanent products, notes, and other handouts, including a handout for this episode. Some items are free and others are not, but everything is affordable. You can also submit a call for papers on our website, www.slpnerdcast.com, to come on the show and present your work with us. You can contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to learn what you have to teach us.
Just a quick disclaimer. The contents of this episode are not meant to replicate clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs. Well, Kate and I aren't, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and a fair representation of each topic that we tackle. With that being said, it's always likely that there's an article we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We love to hear from you.
We also have financial and non-financial disclosures. I really feel like this is so dry. We just need to our financial and non-financial disclosures are always listed on the website, but it is ethical for us to say them before we speak about a topic. I am the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting, LLC. I'm also co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. Amy is an employee of a public school system and also co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. We're both members of ASHA SIG 12. We both serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, otherwise known as BABBIT, Mass ABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Language Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group. So before we get started in today's episode, we just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that this is a talk about AAC, which is typically in the scope of competence of a speech and language pathologist. But we're also going to be talking about ABA, which is obviously in the scope of practice and competence of board-certified behavior analysts. So throughout the course of today's episode, we are sort of talking to two different disciplines who use very different kinds of jargon, and we are going to do our absolute best to make sure that everything is clear. It should also go without saying that we're both practicing speech and language pathologists, but I am also a dually certified BCBA. Amy has done all the training. We have so many wonderful things to say about ABA and the collaboration between these two fields, and we're hoping that comes across throughout the course of today's episode. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about integrating AAC into behavior plans.
And we choose this topic for a couple of different reasons. So, well, first and foremost, we put up a poll on Instagram, and it was whether or not to do an episode about AAC and ABA or mentoring. And we got a lot of responses for both. So we are going to do both, but the ABA and AAC won the poll. So
I feel like we've come a long way in the Instagram, and this should just be acknowledged.
I know how to use Instagram. Are you giving, what'd you say?
Giving you credit.
I learned
a lot.
I learned so many things. When this whole journey first started, I was like, I don't understand what a story is.
Yeah.
And now my fake publicist person, you know who you are, rolled her eyes at me and passed some judgment. But anyway, so we did this poll, and as we started brainstorming, we realized that ABA and AAC can mean a lot of different things. It can mean teaching methodology. It can mean different prompt hierarchies. It can mean so many different things. And what we chose to start with was talking about integrating AAC into the behavioral programming of individuals with behavioral needs who are also non-speaking, which is my total cup of tea, which is very exciting. So stay tuned for additional episodes related to ABA-related teaching procedures, discrete trial training, prompting hierarchies. We are going to get to those topics as promised. We are also going to get to the topics related to mentoring that we also got a lot of responses about. But today we are going to talk about integrating AAC into behavioral programming. We know that this can be a tricky dynamic and that SLPs and BCBAs can sometimes have a hard time collaborating, communicating. We did a whole episode on it, episode 1. Anybody who's interested can go back and listen to it. And before we move forward into the guts of this episode, we want to make it clear that given that this is a talk about AAC, behavioral programming is you can cast a very wide net when you start talking about behavioral programming. Behavior plans can be used to address
Classroom
self-injurious behavior, classroom behavior, dieting, smoking, addiction. This is a talk about AAC and behavioral programming, which inherently means that it's about communication and about how communication can be integrated into a behavioral plan. So for those SLPs out there who might not be as familiar with this world, the world of ABA will often use functional communication as a means of replacing unwanted behavior. So the behavior plan at large will be focused on teaching functional communication or a functional communication response, also abbreviated as FCR, functional communication response, in the absence of unwanted behavior. A classic example I can think of, just to sort of get everybody on the same page, is the 2 toddlers in the sandbox, and one toddler wants the truck, and instead of saying, "Can I have a turn?" he thinks to himself, well, the quickest way to get the truck is just to hit the other kid. And then I will take the truck. So in that instance, they use hitting instead of using functional communication. And so the bulk of the entire episode today is going to be about integrating AAC into behavior plans that are focused around functional communication training and using AAC for functional communication responses. In case we end up using acronyms, FCT is short for functional communication training, and FCR is short for functional communication response. Did I cover everything?
I think you covered a lot of things. The only other thing that that came to mind while you were speaking was thinking about part of why you'll see communication incorporated into behavior plans like that is because when a BCBA has a program to reduce problem behavior like hitting or throwing sand at your friend or any of these socially not appropriate behaviors, you need to also replace that behavior with something that is more appropriate. So to get that same need met. So in your toddler in the sandbox example, the toddler still needs to be able to get access to the truck. So we're just teaching a more socially acceptable way to do that. That
very well said
for other people.
Yes, very well said. So our learning objectives today, we are going to have a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun writing this episode. Learning objectives today include: number 1, identify roles and responsibilities when collaborating around AAC and a behavior plan. Number 2, identify when to modify a tool or select a different tool for integration into a behavior plan. And number 3, identify environmental variables that may play a role in tool modification for behavior plan integration. So we'll start with our first learning objective. Just get right into it. Learning objective number 1, identify roles and responsibilities when collaborating around AAC within a behavior plan.
And as the SLP, only SLP in the room, rather than
SLP.
You're dual certified though. You're both.
I know, but I am still an SLP.
You
I'm
are
an
still
SLP
an
first.
SLP.
I probably always will be. Don't leave me out. I feel left out.
No, you're just in more clubs than I am. That's all. But when we think about functional communication training, I really don't see a way to do this without doing it collaboratively, right? Because back to the idea that if behavior is targeted for reduction, it's not really okay for the BCBA not to address a replacement behavior. So it's not okay to say, well, BCBA, you just work on getting rid of that problem behavior, because they have to also work on something appropriate to replace it. But similarly, it's not okay to leave the SLP out of the loop, because we are talking about replacing it with something that involves communication.
Right. And I think to that, piggybacking on that point, SLPs are very familiar with problem behavior. The comorbidity of problem behavior and communication deficits is high, and it is well documented in the literature. It's not news that, and it's not news to BCBAs that challenging behavior is related to communication difficulty. We found a great article, in case anybody is interested in going down a nerd hole, that does a nice review of the relationship between these two things. It's called Functional Communication Training, a review of the literature related to children with autism. It was published in Education and Training and Developmental Disabilities by, I'm going to say Mansell is his last
That's
name.
how I would have said it. Yeah.
Yep. I would just have a theme of butchering the last
Probably
names.
doing it wrong almost all the time.
Poor authors. Anyway, references on our website if you are interested in learning more about that. Functional communication training, believe it or not, is within both scopes of practice of both of these disciplines. And I think that there's probably a lot of BCBAs listening. Hopefully there's a lot of BCBAs listening. And if you are listening and you're a BCBA, you might be really surprised to hear that. I think both disciplines a lot of times like to operate on an island and have ownership of that island. And BCBAs obviously are, I guess you could say, the experts in behavior management. That's what they go to school for. That's what they get tested for. But they are not the only professionals who are equipped to address functional communication training and behavior modification. We looked a lot in the literature for this, and there is quite a bit of literature that supports use of functional FBAs specifically to try and address, for other disciplines to use FBAs to address behavior management.
And I think, as somebody who's taken a lot of classes in special education, that's not unique to speech language pathologists. So
Right.
there's information out there saying SLPs can do FBAs, but classroom teachers can do FBAs, special educators can do FBAs.
So for those of you who don't know, who are new to this, FBA stands for Functional Behavior Assessment. And Amy's right. I mean, it can be done in the literature. It is within the scope of practice for a speech pathologist, a special educator. There are probably school psychologists who are writing FBAs in different school districts. I think this is definitely also a geographical thing. There are swaths of the country where there aren't very many BCBAs, and there are other professionals who have taken classes or have experience doing FBAs. We're not going to get into this, but this is definitely related to scope of practice versus scope of competence. So as a new graduate speech pathologist, just because doing an FBA is in your scope of practice does not necessarily mean that you have it in your scope of competence. You really should no matter what letters you have after your name, you should really only be doing clinical work that is within not only your scope of practice, but also your scope of competence. So I think it's important to make that caveat that we are not advocating for everybody in the world to be doing FBAs. That's absolutely not true. I just think it's an important thing for BCBAs to acknowledge that they own the majority of the real estate on FBA Island, but there are lots of people who visit there, and there are lots of people who take the train to and from FBA Island and take tips and tricks from FBA Island. It's not an island of one discipline.
I think that that's a great point. And I think if you're somebody who is not a BCBA, but you're interested in learning more about FBAs, there are a lot of professional development resources and texts out there, particularly geared towards special educators that talk about FBAs as a tool for individual students, classroom management, a number of different situations.
And if you are a speech pathologist and you are really interested in learning more about your scope of competence for integrating some FBAs into your sessions, we found a couple of articles that might be helpful for you that are listed on our website. One is Anzik, Canella, and Sigafus, 2016. Another one was McAvoy and Nielsen in 2001. So there are some references on our website. Are you laughing at the word Sigafus? Are you laughing at a person's name? Hopefully that person's not listening.
I've read a lot of articles by that guy, and I've
I was
always
going to say, I
it's
recognize that last name
yeah, Sigafoos, but maybe I have no idea. That's just always how it's been in my head. Like
because
when
who forgets the name Sisyphus?
mhm,
Foos?
maybe
I don't know.
I
Anyway,
don't
moving on. So as we were preparing for this episode, I think, a cornerstone, a good cornerstone for moving forward is acknowledging that this is a shared area, whether people like it or not. This is something that is being done across the country by multiple disciplines, even though we acknowledge and respect that BCBAs, they own most of the real estate on FBA Island. In terms of our content for today, in terms of integrating AAC into functional communication training and behavioral program, we couldn't find much. I could not find much in the literature. There was a lot on, using AAC to improve manning for information skills and, improving all kinds of things. And there was a lot on FCT and behavior in that relationship and, problem behavior reduction. I did find one article published in the Journal of Augmentative Alternative Communication, which looks really, really incredible. And we will have this listed on our website too. We'll talk more about this article a little bit later. But for the introduction of this episode, suffice it to say, there's not a ton out there in terms of research and functional procedures that have been proved to be evidence-based that I could find. I am always willing to be stood corrected. Tell me that I'm wrong, people. Send us an email, share information with me. I couldn't find very much. So in terms of this being a shared area, it isn't too far of a stretch to acknowledge that these two disciplines, speech pathology and behavior analysts, are going to be working together in a lot of collaborative settings or interdisciplinary settings around functional communication training. And it is definitely ethical to work together. Definitely go back and listen to our previous episodes on collaboration if you want to learn more about how important it is for both disciplines to play together well in the sandbox. And I think each discipline, if this is an area that we share, we bring different roles and responsibilities to the team. We each bring different areas of expertise. And in our opinion, it's ideal to have some great collaboration when you start making decisions specifically related to functional communication targets within a behavior plan. It's always great to collaborate. More brains are always better than one brain. More brains are always better than two brains. But I think in most settings, the really key components of collaboration are, yes, you want to consult your entire team, but really between the BCBA and the SLP and possibly the teacher or other really big stakeholders. You really want to make sure that you're moving forward with your behavior plan with those collaborators in your pocket.
I think too, it's almost, you could almost say as a general rule, if the BCBA is writing a functional communication training program that incorporates some form of AAC or not.
Yeah, this is true for everything. If you are writing a behavior plan or any sort of behavioral program that incorporates a functional communication training piece or a functional communication response, so FCT and FCR, you should collaborate with your speech pathologist
Yep.
and or teacher.
Yep.
150% of the time. Now, if you are, it's overwhelmingly true for anyone, but if you are working with a person or a client or a student or whoever, individual who is non-speaking or has limited speech, that is unbelievable. That went from 150% to like bajillion thousand true. That's not even a number. You should absolutely be collaborating bajillion thousand.
No,
You should absolutely be collaborating with your SLP if you're working around writing behavioral programming for someone who is non-speaking. Non-speaking individuals have really specific learning profiles. They're very idiosyncratic. Chances are, if they're non-speaking, they are also in need of behavioral intervention because of that comorbidity. And if that's the case, then they're generally speaking, they're more than likely complex learners all around. In that case, more brains, always better than one brain. Can't say it enough. and I can't believe that I have to say this or that we have to say this, but we're going to say it. If you are writing behavior plans for non-speaking persons or persons with limited speech, you have to include their communication tool, or you have to consider their communication tool, or you have to use rational thinking as to why you are not including their communication tool, or why you would need to make modifications to that communication tool. For persons who are non-speaking, you cannot do this in a vacuum.
No, all of those are decisions that should be collaborative in nature and talked through with the speech language pathologist.
And we're going to get into what each discipline brings to the table, because there is so much amazing stuff that a BCBA will bring to the table that a speech pathologist really needs to acknowledge. But this, I guess the point I'm making is that non-speaking persons or persons with limited speech are a very specific group of individuals where I think a lot of the literature out there doesn't necessarily support the level of complexity that they have in terms of behavioral interventions.
Tell us about the article. Tell us about the awesome article that you found.
My amazing art. Okay, so I found this article, and then I read it, and I got really happy, and then I emailed the author, and now we're pen pals because it was so good. And if anybody's listened to previous episodes, I hate reading articles, and I never read them, but this one was so good. I even read the methods section. I didn't even just skip to the end. It was really, really wonderful. So this article by Kelly and Tincani in 2013 was published in Education and Training in Autism and Developmental Disabilities. And it's called Collaborative Training and Practice Among Applied Behavior Analysts Who Support Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorders. And this article was so good, it deserves its own episode. We are going to repurpose it and use it again. I am not going to get into the guts of this article for right now, but essentially it reviews the importance of collaboration, and it reports data on surveys that were distributed to behaviorally oriented professionals, and it outlines a common theme that has emerged from research, and this is a quote. So, a common theme emerging from research on consultation is that a collaborative approach involving shared decision-making between professionals leads to improved consumer outcomes. So that quote.
Outcomes. That sounds very good.
Yeah, improved. Yeah.
That's what we want.
Yeah, we want that. But I think the key word there is shared decision-making.
I would agree.
And collaboration is a two-way street. And that is a situation in which you are not only providing your expertise, but you are listening to the input and valuing the input and using that input to collaborate around decision making when you're making. And this is absolutely what should be done when you are writing behavior plans with functional communication responses for non-speaking persons.
And you're actively integrating the perspectives of all the different stakeholders. And we talked a lot about this, in previous podcasts, but it really is important not just to give the other stakeholders a chance to talk while you formulate what you're going to say next, but to actually listen and try and integrate what their perspective, the perspective that they're sharing with you, into the clinical decision-making process moving forward. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to agree, but I think it is incumbent on all of us as team-based service providers to really try and at least walk through the exercise of taking the perspective of the other person and what they bring to the table, with the recognition that everybody has different expertise that we're not privy to. I didn't go to school to be an OT. I'm going to acknowledge that I don't have the background that they do. So even though some of the things that might be suggested don't completely make sense to me, I'm going to go into that interaction with an open mind and really try and integrate important components into my treatment as well.
Yeah. And just to sort of piggyback on that a little bit further, we found another article. This was really just an article hole for me. Actually, my pen pal sent it to me. You know who you are, pen pal. An article by Broadhead and published in 2015, reference on our website. So this article really goes through we basically acknowledging that BCBAs can be in really difficult positions when they are collaborating and being asked to support treatments that might not be evidence-based or might not, feel that they can participate and adhere to the ethical code. And this article, Broadhead 2015, walks you through decision trees on how to maintain those relationships without feeling that you're in violation of your ethical code or supporting treatments that you don't believe are evidence-based. But this what we're talking about today, AAC and functional communication training and behavior plans related surrounding rooted in functional communication training, that is not a situation where you are, as the BCBA, going to be asked to participate in something that's not evidence-based. In this situation, the BCBA is going to be doing all of the plan. You're writing the behavior plan. I mean, this is a situation where you're using all of your behavior analytic skills. You're writing your behavior. You're adhering to the code. You're really just getting input and collaborating on maybe what the functional communication response is, or what the target vocabulary is, or what the replacement communication is. This amazing article, the Kelly and Tinkani one, describes this as a collaborative directive approach. And I absolutely loved this.
What is a collaborative directive approach?
So everyone should read this article. This article is so good. So in the collaborative directive approach is one where the consultant, which is the BCBA, where it's basically a situation in which the BCBA employs shared decision-making and receives the other's right to and acknowledges that the other person has the right to reject the interventions, but they are the ones that make the prescriptive recommendation where appropriate. So the example that they gave in the article was where the BCBA takes all the input from the teacher, lets the teacher help identify the most important problem behaviors that need to be decreased, lets the teacher choose what behaviors would be most socially applicable in the classroom or most beneficial in the classroom. And they take all of that information, but then the behavior analyst is the one who prescribes the actual treatment. So instead of saying, well, let's use facilitated communication, they would take their body of knowledge and use their expertise in evidence-based and effective treatment approaches and design the actual treatment with the input from the teacher. And I absolutely loved this. I thought it was great. It's called the collaborative directive approach to collaboration.
One thing that I liked a lot is just that it gives other people veto power, sort of, which I like a lot. So, sometimes what will come up is perhaps a disagreement about the optimal modality for your functional communication response or whatever. In hearing you talk about this, it makes me feel like if you had a very strong objection for whatever reason, you would be able to object to that. And then you would kind of go back to the drawing board collaboratively with the BCBA, with the speech pathologist, and come up with something else that works for everybody.
Right. It's a process. You're molding clay. I mean, you're making mistakes. You're going back to the drawing board. You're redrafting everything. You're getting your hands dirty. That is the joy of collaboration. But then in this collaborative directive approach, it's the BCBA who has the, I guess you could say, final say on the technology that's involved, on the not the computer, but like the process and procedure, the scientific principles that are going to be applied to actually create the behavior change. So a tiny little soapbox, but it's really important to this topic because when you are integrating language into a behavior plan, it is absolutely essential to make sure that these collaborative processes happen always, but especially for non-speaking individuals or persons with limited speech. So let's review quickly the different things that SLPs and BCBAs bring to the table. Both disciplines are amazing. I am incredibly biased as a dually certified SLP and BCBA. And I think just like everything, there are strengths and weaknesses. And there are certain things that SLPs bring to the table that are huge strengths that I think are important to highlight. So first of all, SLPs have a huge background in language development and developmental norms. That's super important when you're considering a functional communication response, right?
Yes. And I think it's important for lots of different reasons. I think it's important to know your speech pathologist is an excellent resource to figure out what is the general distribution of the first 50 words that a typically developing individual might have in their repertoire. What do they tend to do with those 50 words once they acquire them? Oh, they start combining them into all of these different types of two-word combinations.
Oh, look at that.
Oh my, brown stages.
Look at that. And the other piece of, so there's the language development and developmental norms, but it's also your speech pathologist knows your student or client's current language level. So where do they fall on those developmental norms?
Yes.
Where are they following a deviant trajectory or a delayed trajectory? Those are two different things.
Correct.
Nothing makes me crazier than a functional communication target or a functional communication response target that is linguistically inappropriate. This makes my brain explode. And it's you shouldn't be as a BCBA, and I am a BCBA. I didn't get any of that developmental norms and language development information in BCBA school. I got that in speech school. So, you really need to make sure that you're considering some of these norms and what is appropriate for your student or client when you are choosing those targets. You should use targets that are universally understood and applied by other people. And you should make sure that they match the student or client's language level. That's incredibly important. And then your SLP is going to bring all that to the table.
It's important for so many reasons. Also, it's the one that comes to mind first, I think, is that if you pick something that is far out of sync with your client's actual current performance level, they're less likely to acquire that skill. But what you also see sometimes happening, particularly with individuals with autism, is you may see some folks able to memorize big, long, gestalt, like chunks of phrases, but then they're not able to segment those different pieces into different parts, and you're better off actually teaching the skills that are going to be consistent and meaningful for them. So memorizing a long phrase like "I need a break, please" might not be the most important fit, even if you might be able to do it with oral speech, when we're just working on teaching the meaning of that single word break.
Right. And we can make the argument the other way around also, but we're going to talk about that when we get into the BCBA section. So now that we have covered the importance of making sure that that the BCBA has consulted the speech pathologist. This all sounds very accusatory. I want to make it clear this is not at all accusatory. This is supposed to be educational, not because I keep saying you. You should do this, you should do that. It's collectively, it's all of us. But the speech pathologist on your team, on a BCBA's team, the speech pathologist at large generally does bring a lot of that wealth of knowledge to the table. If your SLP is experienced in AAC, they may also have a lot of knowledge of other tools or strategies that could be used if the tool needs to be modified because of a behavioral issue.
I would say that your SLP also can help build your knowledge base as a BCBA. So just like I have learned so very, very much about behavior from working with very skilled BCBAs, I have worked with awesome BCBAs who have been listening and collaborating with SLPs and talked to me about brown stages. So not only are you doing it because it's ethical and it's the right thing to do, it enriches your practice as well. And through working repeatedly with speech language pathologists, some of that knowledge becomes your knowledge too.
Yes, you wear many hats when you collaborate, because you learn so much from so many different disciplines. So this is the wealth of knowledge that the SLP brings to the table. When SLPs come to the table for collaboration around functional communication responses, there are also some things that they should probably remember. We, you, all these pronouns, because there's two different disciplines. I'm going to try and just use the acronym. So when SLPs come to the table to collaborate around FCT, first of all, we need to remember that collaboration is ethical and it's really important. But sometimes behavior takes precedence. Sometimes addressing the behavior in a way that has a low response effort or in a way that is easy for the client to address is more important than what your language and communication goal is. So we assume that if you're listening, you have an AAC user or an aided communicator that has a behavior plan. Is the behavior dangerous? Is it really complex? Can the BCBA explain to you why the communication isn't being prioritized?
Well, and I think this is the flip side of the earlier example, right?
Yes.
This is not the time to work on teaching a language skill. If what we're working on collaboratively together, the we, is to reduce this behavior that's really important and impactful. Maybe it is dangerous. Maybe it is very complicated. This is not the time that we're going to work on, maximizing your morphology skills, right? Like there's a time and a place for everything. And so I think it goes both ways. It goes. So this is where the you becomes the SLP. Don't you?
I'm
SLP.
getting my pronouns. This is my the other half of my brain just exploded. I'm not going to be able to do the pronouns, but I'm following you. I'm following you for the most part. But I think that what's important to exactly what you said. So another example that I have written down here in my notes is, and this, I was a party to this experience recently where we had a student who was engaging in some dangerous behavior, and the functional communication response was something along the lines of, break. It was like a one word, quick and dirty, just functionally asking for escape from the demands to reduce the head hitting. And the SLP on the case was completely bent out of shape because she or he, we'll make it anonymous, felt that the functional communication response should have been something related to feelings because that was a goal that she or he was working on, saying, I'm mad. That's really what she wanted because she felt that that was a great opportunity for the student to express that they were mad. And while, yes, that is a great opportunity, that was a developing skill. That was not a skill that the student had. And in that situation, giving the student something that was already in their repertoire that they could use to reduce the unwanted behavior was so much more important. So another example of this is, let's say you have a student who is at the one-word level, and the SLP is working on core vocabulary, and they're really working on the word go. The word go is really, really important, but the student also has, but the BCBA has a behavior plan where there's a phrase-based button programmed on the device, and the phrase-based button says, I need space, please. And it's right on the home page, and there is a huge disagreement because the SLP says, I want you to use the word go as your functional communication response because that's a target, as in go away or go somewhere else. And that's the SLP says that's the functional communication target that I want because I think it's a great opportunity to generalize it. And the BCBA says, no way, right? So they have this big argument. So then the question becomes, why, from the SLP's perspective, there is a chance that behavior plan is written that way because the behavior is dangerous. The word go is not going to be universally understood by the staff at the residence or the guy at the Dunkin' Donuts. The student doesn't have the tolerance when they're mad to go 3 hits from the home screen to find the word go. They need something quick and they need something dirty. So in these situations, my whole point is that for the speech pathologists out there listening, there are instances where behavior is more important. And yes, your goals and objectives or the core vocabulary that you're working on is really important. And maybe the conversation with the BCBA becomes about how to morph it over time with your objectives. Maybe use the same symbol for the word go and put the words go away right on the home screen. Maybe find some way to generalize. And do you see how I did that there? Married those two.
You met in the middle. You compromised.
In the middle, right?
Yourself, which is
it's just really important to acknowledge that you're not always right. Even if your goals and objectives there may be method to the madness. And I think if you don't collaborate, you never find out.
Well, and I think in a lot of instances, it's not necessarily, in your example, it's not that go is the only right answer or I need space is the only right answer. I think, that's part of what comes out of that conversation is, getting the perspective. We talked earlier about how speech language pathologists have so much training, and we learn so much information about typical expressive and receptive language development, as well as speech sound production and how that develops. When you think about behavior analysts, while there's not a developmental trajectory for behavior per se, I think that that's part of what those folks really can bring to the table is help the other providers understand the difference between, oh, well, the reason we're doing this particular thing is because of all of these factors connected with the behavior. So perhaps this behavior, you gave the example of, perhaps it's dangerous. And when it's dangerous, we want the response effort to be very low. And so that is why I would recommend blah, 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 because these are the variables that the BCBA is thinking about. So
And
just
and what you just said is the exact conversation that needs to take place in
Mhm.
collaboration is really understanding why those language targets were chosen because of different components of that.
And I think for both personnel in the conversation to be able to set aside any previous experiences that you've had that may have been frustrating, right? So maybe that BCBA had a previous conversation in a very similar circumstance, maybe with that exact same SLP where you got in a fight about go versus not go. You need to be able to, for the sake of being a professional and working toward those improved client outcomes that you were referencing in that earlier article, you need to be able to set that aside and let every situation be a new situation and go into it open to hearing and asking questions to try and figure things out. So if I'm the SLP who feels very strongly it should be go, my client has mastered go in all of these different contexts, they're using it appropriately. This seems like a great opportunity to generalize it in a really meaningful way. I need to be prepared to ask actual probing questions so that I can get the answers to my questions from the BCBA. And likewise, hopefully the BCBA would ask those same questions of the SLP so you can get that place in the middle like you found.
Yeah, place in the happy place in the middle.
Happy place in the middle.
Collaboration station. That's what we'll call it. The
That's
happy
right.
place in the middle. So
Mhm.
those are all the things that the SLP brings to the table. This great wealth of knowledge about language development, developmental norms, where your student or client falls on the trajectory of developmental norms. BCBAs should 100% be collaborating with their SLPs around how to choose functional communication response targets for speaking and especially non-speaking individuals or individuals with limited speech, and talking to them about tool modification and how their communication tools could be integrated into that plan. And we are going to talk about that in a minute.
Sorry, for what it's worth, even when you have I have the good fortune of having some wonderful BCBAs who I've worked with regularly and they know what I'm gonna say, but they still do the check-in and that's super nice, right? Like
Yeah.
when you're at a close friend's house and you still ask them if you can have some chips, right? Like the answer is gonna be yes. Your friend's not gonna say no, all of a sudden you can't have the chips, but
The
it's
next
just
time you're at my house, you can just eat my chips. You don't have to ask me for my chips. If
but
that's
I
what
will
you're
ask
getting at.
because it's the principle of the thing and that makes us, it's a
It's the
courtesy.
principle of the thing. No, you're
Mhm.
right. So, what do BCBAs bring to the table for all of our SLPs listeners out there? So, we know we have some literature up on our website, some references related to the effectiveness of behavior analytic work and how effective it is to improving behavior for kids in the classroom. And AAC is no different. Or and improving the behavior of our non-speaking individuals or those clients we have who have a comorbidity or also have behavioral needs. There's no different. BCBAs, they have knowledge of the actual behavior plan. They have the knowledge how to actually improve some of these behaviors that are hurdles to communication. And that's amazing. That is so important. I have had a bajillion, I'm making up a lot of math numbers today, a bajillion clients / students who have behaviors that impede communication or are hurdles to communication. This is so common. And a BCBA is the professional that is going to either help you reduce some of those behaviors or make your client more available and ready and more available for learning. Um, This is the great wealth of knowledge that they bring to the table. They can help you decide what kind of data to collect, how to measure some of these increases and decreases. If you're in an intercollab in a team, they're going to be the ones who are making those decisions, maybe even the ones who are collecting the data. They're the ones who have the rationale behind choosing functional communication training instead of another component of a behavior plan.
And I think that's another piece where there's such an opportunity for growth, because sometimes, back to your example of, wanting the student to say, I'm angry, I think when the BCBA is approaching it and saying, yes, but I did this assessment and it turns out the function of this dangerous behavior is actually avoidance, right? They want to replace that behavior with something that is a functional equivalent for that behavior. So in that example, saying I'm angry doesn't actually get you the same things.
That's exactly what you just took all the words out of my thinking bubble. I'm like hopping up and down in my chair because you're absolutely right. The BCBA is the one who is going to identify accurately with science what the function of that behavior is to help choose what the functional communication response is. And these are really fun conversations to have. I have them with myself. No, I don't. I'm just kidding. To have with the other person across the aisle, so to speak, in our polarized world. But I think, we've already reviewed a lot of what BCBAs can remember when they come to the table. So first of all, we've already, just to hammer it home, SLPs have that knowledge of where your student or client is in terms of developmental norms and language. But communicating is a complex process, and it's even more complex when you're talking about an AAC user. We are going to get to the AAC component of this. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about all of these other collaborative things. So verbal behavior for a non-speaking person or a person with limited speech they have long histories with their communication tool in most situations. And the AAC tool may or may not be appropriate depending on the learning history of the student and the tool in question. These are very complex processes and these are decisions that need to be made specific to the individual, because augmentative alternative communication it's a whole well of knowledge. I mean, it's going to be, whether or not we like it, it's going to be a specialty area in the field of speech and language pathology.
Wow.
So we're not going to open that box. But, the point I'm making is that the BCBAs who come to the table need to remember that, yes, while everything is a behavior and everything passes the dead man's test and verbal behavior is in your scope of practice. Yes, we agree. But there's a big but there. AAC is a very specific field. And while you may be a BCBA who has this in their scope of competence because you've been around it a lot or you worked with a great AAC specialist for a long time and you know a lot, you should still be collaborating with your speech pathologist to make some of these specific decisions. And we have a few guidelines, a couple of things for BCBAs to keep in mind. So aside from the fact that developmental norms should be considered, symbol type should be considered. So don't use something that nobody understands. I had a team one time, they had an FCR for a non-speaking person, and the kid was supposed to touch an X. It was an X. It was just a letter X, but this kid had a whole communication system. So I showed up and I was like, so guys, what's with the X? They're like, oh, well, when he touches the X, he gets to go have a break. And it's the FCR because, he's head hitting, keep coming using the same example. And I was like, all right, well, that's cool. But nobody understands the X. And he has this whole symbol system. So can we just replace the X with a symbol from his system so that we can thinking a million years ahead, maybe he can use his device instead of this random X. So you have to consider the symbols that you are using and plan for generalization and plan for effectiveness and carryover and all of these kinds of things. The communication modality and the learning history should be considered. And when we say communication modality, we mean sign versus the device versus is it light tech? Is it high tech? Is it unaided, meaning it's a gesture or something? All of and these are things that the SLP should be considering too.
Yes.
This is something, part of the discussion that you need to have. Learning history should be considered. So I've had students who, when you put a laminated piece of paper in front of them, they will assault you because they have learned over time that laminated materials equal work. So is there something specific about the student's learning history that makes you want to think about what kind of tools you should or shouldn't be using? And the other thing, I guess the final point is how the symbol can be used in the community and how it can be understood by others. This is sort of piggybacking onto that X example. Even if, let's say, the student doesn't have a robust symbol system, or you're doing you have an itty bitty who has nothing, at least choose something that could be generalized and used outside of the four walls of your clinic or your classroom or wherever. There are so many things to consider with functional communication training targets, what vocabulary word to use, what their language level is, if they're a non-speaking person, what symbol should be used. And I hope we covered most of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I'm talking very fast. Okay. Learning objective number 2. We're going to move on to learning objective number 2. So we started talking about AAC tools. When to identify, learning objective number 2 is identify when to modify a tool or select a different tool for integration into a behavior plan. Amy and I, when we were having this discussion and prepping for this episode, I think it's important, I think Amy, you said this, that it's important for even SLPs to acknowledge that or be okay and comfortable with the fact that sometimes the tool might need to change. Just because the kid is using Touch Chat or Nova Chat or an Accent or LAMP doesn't mean that it has to be that thing across the board all the time. When, this is a caveat here, when you have a very complex individual with a high level of need for behavioral services.
Well, and this is where I get to pop up in my soapbox for just a very short period of time. But when we think about AAC is not just one high-tech tool. And I think, when in 2012, when iPads came out and all of these apps started hitting the market, and now we have, way broader access to robust speech generating tools than we did before. There's a much wider range of individuals who are being served by high-tech AAC tools than were prior to 2012. And that is both wonderful. And, with that comes some things that you need to stop and think about, which are that one tool isn't the only tool. So augmented communicators, just like non-augmented communicators, we use a variety of robust tools. I send people texts on my phone because I hate calling people on the phone, but sometimes I'll call people on the phone. Now,
just your close friends.
Right.
No, that's a level of intimacy that we share. We reserve for a small pool of people these days.
Yes.
I had met someone recently, just a side note, and I had one conversation with them, and then they called me and I was like, what is this?
Very invasive.
I haven't let you into my phone call bubble. How dare you?
It's a small bubble.
Anyway, go on.
No, oral speech, typing, Zoom calls, all of these things are different modalities that we use in different environments with different communication partners. And that's no different for people who are augmented communicators. So yes, that's true for a consideration for a behavior plan, but that's also true just in general in life. There are very few people for whom a high-tech tool is their only modality. And we'll talk way more about that in our AAC Basics podcast in the future. But
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
I do think it's important to say that as AAC practitioners, we acknowledge the importance of consistency. So we're not advocating that you have 15 different language systems that you're using all the same time. But this is not an island of one.
No, and most of us have unaided modalities that we're using in addition to aided modalities. And I mean, just as we were getting ready to record this podcast, I had to troubleshoot all of my tech because my Wi-Fi was crashing. And, tech problems happen. So I think, yes, your primary go-to system might be your high-tech speech generating tool, but there should always be other backup systems and redundancies built into place because tech fails.
Right. And I think that this is a great segue into into the first bullet we have here about modifying tools for behavior plans. Is it unsafe? Is the behavior in question aggression or self-injurious behavior? Does the iPad become a weapon? Is it at risk of being smashed? Um, there are lots of different things you can consider when you're working with this. There's light tech tools. There are, unaided strategies like signing. If you're using a light tech tool, maybe you try and make it consistent across the tools. So you're using a symbol that's consistent with whatever software platform you have in your high tech tool. Maybe it needs to be a gesture because gestures are quick and dirty and you have your hands on you all the time. And it's less of a safety issue. And I think the point we're trying to make here is for the SLPs out there, when you have a behavior that is dangerous, or maybe if it's not dangerous, maybe it's high frequency, it's just all the time, there is room for total communication. Total communication approach is okay. You do not have to have your lamp device open and with you all the time if you have an individual who is, engaging in self-injurious behavior at high rates. And I think, just like I said, you try and stick to the same tool when you can, but there is room for flexibility. Another thing I think that comes up a lot related to high tech tools is response effort. So we've used the word response effort a couple times. Response effort is exactly what it sounds like it is. How much effort you have to put in to get a desired outcome. So how much effort does the response actually take? And this sort of goes into frustration tolerance. So when you're working with someone who has behavioral needs, they may not be able to tolerate the 4 hits from the home screen or the 3 hits from the home screen to engage in, a functional communication response that's part of their behavior plan. So maybe you program that button right on the home page. I've gotten weird sometimes and pulled pieces of POD. So for those of you who don't know what POD is, Pragmatic Organization of Dynamic Display, where you prioritize linguistic functions before specific vocabulary units. So maybe you have a something's wrong icon right on your home screen, even though it's lamp. Get weird. You can, be really creative around these kinds of things.
I think also planning for the days where, in the moments where your frustration tolerance is lowest, is helpful. So there may be some times when your client is able to navigate through and do this multi-symbol utterance at a time of higher frustration. But, their dog kept them up all night for the last 3 nights and is being a little crazy. Their frustration tolerance is a little lower
What
than
doesn't
normal.
happen to your dog? What do you
Um, but I think we want to work together and collaborate on functional communication programs to make sure that the client is able to be successful across a lot of different environments and situations.
And one of our last bullets about related to editing a tool or modifying a tool within a behavior plan is independence and generalization. So this was that really awesome article that we sort of glossed over at the beginning, published in the Journal of Augmentative Alternative Communication by Mateer, Randall, Van Winkle, and Greer, 2020. The title of the article was Incorporating Discriminative Stimuli into Functional Communication Training with Augmentative and Alternative Communication Devices. I was so excited to find this article because I feel like I make this recommendation all the time just because, and now there's evidence for it. There's an article about it. So are your teams planning for generalization when you introduce a functional communication response? So let's say you've made this tool modification. You're not using a high-tech tool because of safety issues or whatever issue you decided to come up with through your collaboration. You're using a laminated card or you're using a light tech tool. What are you going to do when it works in your classroom, but you need to integrate it into your iPad? Are there stimuli in the environment that are part of the behavior plan that you can slowly shape or integrate into the device so that the student or client eventually can learn to self-prompt because presumably they're an AAC user, hopefully they have their device with them or some form of augmentative alternative communication with them throughout the day. How are you planning now that you've modified the tool? How are you planning to reintegrate that stimuli back into the tool?
Well, because our ultimate goal is that people are able to independently advocate for their needs and wants everywhere all the time and be as understood as is ultimately possible for them.
And so, yes, and I would highly recommend that someone read this article, because basically what it does is it reviews a procedure where the discriminative stimuli in a behavior plan were used within FCT, and then the procedure integrates that into the device. And it was really exciting to find that in the literature. I was happy about that.
Last learning objective.
Yes, our last learning objective. I'm looking at my outline. I'm getting a little lost here. I think I have them
So
outlined in the wrong way.
we talked just now a bit about kind of client variables that might make us modify the tool. And I think that is half of the equation, right? So we have the client variables that might be safety related, that might be learning history related, that would make the collaborative group step back and say, we should maybe do something a little bit differently. There are also environmental variables that could result in the same outcome, right? So you could have variables within the client, you could have variables within the environment and the learner that also might result, or the environment and the communication partners, excuse me, that might result in a need for a modification to the primary tool or the selection of an alternative tool.
What might those be?
Some of the ones that we thought about were, thinking about different learning environments. You may have somebody who is just learning to use a high-tech tool, so a speech generating device, and perhaps they're learning it in a very limited environment. So maybe an outpatient clinic, or, maybe in the school environment, and they haven't yet generalized the use of that tool to other environments, but they have a challenging behavior that you really want to help support them in shaping to be a more safe and socially, understandable communication response. So that might be a time to think flexibly, especially if you have, folks who have had a different system in place historically and are transitioning to a more robust system. This might be a nice time to look at that previous system that, is still in their repertoire, and thinking about the task demands. We don't want you to have to do something new and hard in a new and hard place.
Mm-hmm.
So we can keep some of that easy and have as few things be new and hard as possible. That's really a better recipe for success. Water. People people talk about water all the time, whether that's the bathroom or the pool or the beach. I mean, I think we've all been trained to realize electronics and water, they don't mix.
They don't mix.
They're not friends. So, having alternatives, if you have somebody who really enjoys water play, or, needs to communicate specific messages in the bath, those would be times to think. I've seen some really cool things done with like the kick floats in
Oh,
swimming.
really?
Yeah. So like either printing it onto a kick float,
Oh,
or
that's such a good idea.
right. Cause like you're not going to be using your high tech tool in the swimming pool. There actually are some bags made for underwater camera equipment, but let's say you're not using one of those bags. You're already on your kick float, right? So you're like, your body's right there. So it's just integrating it into that. So just thinking flexibly about your environment. And if you're someone who's taking a lot of swimming lessons, you're doing a lot of communicating with your kick float, maybe you can just use that board in different places. So what else have we thought about? We thought about also just different partners and tasks. Sometimes you have communication partners who aren't in a place where they're able to, if you have a communicator who's not super independent and robust yet with their system, you may have partners who aren't able to be the best communication partners, and therefore they are not setting the stage for that person to utilize robust communication in all environments. So some communication systems require less support than others. You may have just environmental engineering. You may be, a family may say, it's just a lot easier for me to have, different things up on the fridge and up on the cabinets, and that just works better for our life. That's really important.
It's really important. And I think that's really important for both the BCBA and the SLP to acknowledge and embrace some of that collaborative directive. Was that the description? Collaborative directive consultation, where the parent or the home residential staff or, whatever whoever the communication partners are in that other environment, acknowledge, I'm really intimidated by LAMP. If he's hitting his head, I know he can do it at school, but I'm not going to go over and wake it up and turn it on. I need alternative communication strategies for this functional communication response at home because of all of these additional reasons. And when you get that input, then you can do the prescriptive, designing of the implementation plan, or the SLP can design that communication board or communication materials specifically to fit that environment. I think that's a really great use of, it's such a great opportunity for that collaborative directive approach. And I think those were pretty much all of our learning objectives. I did want to say one quick thing that as part of this episode, we are going to upload on our website some permanent products and checklists related to those collaborative discussions. So we're hoping to create a checklist or set of interview questions for the BCBA to send to a speech pathologist. So we know that you guys, a lot of us don't have time. We don't have time. Time is a huge barrier to collaboration. So it's ideal if you could take these checklists or set of questions and have a conversation with your counterpart. And we intend for these questions to be the starters for great discussions between SLPs and BCBAs. Worst case scenario, you could email it, you could drop it in their mailbox at work. I just think it's really important to try and find ways to make the collaborative process a lot easier and less contentious.
Yeah, and I think especially that's true for everybody. I think it's particularly true when you're thinking about people in environments where you're working frequently with a similar group of people. And that might be people who are in a school-based setting and are working with a similar group of providers, or people in EI who are working with a similar group of providers, or, you're in an outpatient clinic, but a lot of your families use, home-based therapy provider XYZ. I think that anything that we can do to open doors, ask questions, learn more from one another, it really does ultimately benefit our clients. And that's why we all got into this in the first place. So I think, stepping back from yourself and reframing and remembering that it's all about the people who you're working to help can help you.
Yeah. I mean, it's so simply said, but it's so true. And I think that pretty much wraps us up. Mm-hmm. We covered a lot of things. I feel like I did a lot of talking. I hope it wasn't aversive.
It was lovely.
All the pronouns and the arguing I did secretly and quietly in my head. I feel like a crazy person. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more episodes on AAC basics and mentoring, and a lot more on AAC and ABA as promised. If you are interested in using this episode for ASHA certification maintenance hours, go to our website to take the quiz and purchase the certificate. If you are a teacher and you are interested in using this for professional development, contact your licensing board to make sure it counts, and stay tuned for information on using this podcast as BACB credit, ACE provider status. Very exciting.
Very exciting.
Very exciting.
We'll be here with you next week.
Yeah, we will not see you, but we will be here with you next week. Thanks, everyone.